With a showdown looming in Washington, the Congressional Budget Office said this week that the U.S. is on target to add a staggering $19 trillion to the national debt in the next 10 years as the bill for runaway spending and a historic expansion of the federal government comes due. But President Biden is accusing Republicans of taking the economy hostage with their call to restrain spending as part of a deal to raise the debt ceiling.
Some of our Republican friends in the House are talking about taking the economy hostage over the full faith and credit of the United States. I will not negotiate whether or not we pay our debt. I will not allow this nation to default.
Let's bring in a veteran of past spending and debt ceiling fights, former Republican Senator Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania. Senator, thanks so much for doing this. What did you learn this week from about the budget and our fiscal problems from this report?
Well, I mean, the CBO is confirming that things are getting worse, considerably worse, and in multiple ways. The deficit itself is growing. The interest service on that debt is getting worse. And, you know, I have to say, to me, it is the height of irresponsibility for President Biden to say he's not going to have any negotiations over actually bending the curve on a completely unsustainable fiscal path that we're on right now. The unreasonable person is the one who refuses to acknowledge that we need to do something about this. And by the way, I just want to get out there, Paul. One of the most disturbing tactics that the White House and Democratic allies use is the suggestion that if the debt ceiling isn't raised by X date, then we're going to default on our debt and create a financial crisis. That's what the president is implying when he talks about holding the economy hostage. Now, the fact is, there is zero risk that the United States government is going to miss a payment on a bond or a note or any of its other securities that would be disruptive if we did. And the reason I say that is because ongoing tax revenue, according to the CBO this year, is 7.5 times the net interest expense. So what administration would willfully choose to default on the debt rather than delaying payments to a vendor or something of that nature? So they characterize it this way so as to make Republicans look unreasonable when Republicans say we need to negotiate some spending discipline.
But of course, the Wall Street is also sounding the alarm here. They say, oh, well, you know, there's a risk of default. You're saying that the cash that comes in, and it keeps coming in. I mean, the revenue doesn't stop because there's a fight like this. It keeps coming in. And the Treasury would allocate that money, any rational Treasury, to pay the bondholders. And then, of course, some other people might not get paid, which is a different political issue, but it wouldn't lead to default.
There's no way there would be a default, right? Look at the CBO numbers. It's $640 billion for fiscal year 2023, the year we're in net interest expense. They're projecting $4.8 trillion in revenue. It's 7.5 times the debt service. There's no way there would be a default. And increasingly, you're seeing the more sophisticated analysis on Wall Street and among economists acknowledging this. Now, by the way, I'm not suggesting that that's the optimal outcome here, but my point is there's not a financial crisis. There's not a calamity that happens if we get past the X date. Some vendors are going to wait to get paid. That's not ideal. But it's also not ideal to have a completely unsustainable fiscal path that is going to result in a disaster at some point if we don't change the road that we're on.
I want to ask you about revenues, because when you look at the report, there last year with almost 20% of the economy, which has only been hit one or two couple of times in the last, since World War II. So revenues are going up. Now, the Democrats will say, okay, so, you know, Pat Toomey, Paul Gigot, you fret about the deficits, but the tax cut of 2017 was responsible. So what's the real evidence about revenues and taxes in the wake of the tax reform?
Yeah, it's really quite stunning. You're exactly right. I think it was actually during World War II and then around 2000 during the tech bubble that are the only 2 years since we've recorded this that the revenue exceeded the level it came in at last year. So we were told in 2017 that if we passed that tax reform, we'd have this huge shortfall of revenue that would last for years and cause this huge increase in the deficit. In fact, we have record high revenue. The revenue last year, by the way, not only did it come in above what the Joint Tax Committee estimated the tax reform would result in, it came in above what they had projected would occur if there were no tax reform. So if you actually just look at the way the numbers came in, it looks like in the context of tax reform, we had even more revenue than what was projected without it. By the way, the most dramatic changes we made were on the business side of the tax code, and corporate tax revenue as a share of all revenue and as a share of GDP also well above historical averages. So it's definitely a spending problem.
So we have about a minute left. What should Republicans in the debt ceiling negotiations seek? Because they obviously can't get everything. What should they want?
Well, I'll tell you, politically, the most important thing is that they can pass something. It really changes the leverage of Kevin McCarthy if he can point to something that was actually passed in the House. And that's going to be really, really hard. But there are some things that could be done. Some procedural things. For instance, you could attach work requirements to various welfare programs. That would have the effect of reducing spending over time. You could claw back some of the COVID-related spending blowouts that still haven't been spent. It would be completely reasonable to claw some of that back. But ultimately, we do need to change the growth rate of the mandatory spending that is almost 2/3 of all spending. That's the only way we're going to actually solve this problem.
All right, Senator Toomey, thanks so much for coming in. Appreciate it.